Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and colleagues around the world. We're starting a minute or two late. Give us about 30 seconds for everybody to get into the webinar, and then we'll get going. Okay, why don't we get started? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and colleagues around the world. My name is Larry Kelly, and welcome to the inaugural session of the World Affairs program of the MIT Club. I am thrilled to kick off our new program on the subject of world affairs and democracy. The goal is to examine world affairs and to promote the understanding and advancement of democracy and freedom. Tonight's event has over 100 registrants. Democracy is under pressure around the world. Just reading the news this morning would give one enough material to fill up all the time allotted for our event this evening. Here is a sampling. There is war in Ukraine. Somewhere between 7 and 11 million people have been displaced. There are over 200,000 casualties. Is Russia going through a dead cat bounce? What happens after Putin? As we are meeting right now in real time, China is experiencing the largest protests since the Tiananmen pro-democracy movement in 1989, protests over the COVID lockdowns and related censorship. In addition, China flies an increasing number of fighter jets towards and around Taiwan daily. There are large protests in Iran over the repression by the morality police and over the dress code for women. Were Iran's players coerced into singing their national anthem at their second World Cup match? Did today's football match between the US and Iran help relations between these two countries? There is a swing towards autocracy in Latin America. 7 million people have left Venezuela in the last decade. That's 25% of the population. And of course, there's plenty of political discourse here in the city on the hill, our United States. Please let me introduce tonight's speaker, Larry Diamond of Stanford. Larry is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is a Mosbacher Senior Fellow in Global Democracy at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a Bass University Fellow in undergraduate education at Stanford University. He is also a professor of political science and sociology at Stanford. He leads the Hoover Institution's programs on China's global sharp power and on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region. At FSI, he leads the program on Arab Reform and Democracy, based at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, which he directed for more than 6 years. Larry founded the CDDRL 20 years ago. He is also the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and has developed a MOOC on comparative democratic development. I could sing Larry's praises for a long time. Instead, if you're interested in learning more about him and his work, let me put a URL or several URLs in the chat. You can check them out now. And I would encourage you to take a look at those. We've also enabled live Q&A, and I'll do my best to get many of these questions to Larry during the Q&A session, along with many of the questions we got from online registration. However, tonight's large audience will mean that we'll only be able to answer a small percentage of the live Q&A. I'll be back after Larry's talk to cover Q&A. So over to you, Larry, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Larry. It's a great honor to be with you and engage this, I'm sure, brilliant and distinguished audience. I'm going to share my screen and show some slides, and then we'll spend some time discussing them. So let me talk about what's been a gathering global crisis of democracy. There are some signs it's maybe easing a little bit, and then offer some thoughts about how to reverse it. I'd like to begin with this quote from Hannah Arendt, which I used in my 2019 book, Ill Winds. I think it resonates with our time, that we still face, and it still kind of characterizes our time, the cause of freedom versus tyranny. I won't promote my book any further, but a lot of what I have to say today derives from that book, and this lecture is simply an update of that, but the analysis remains, I think, still quite valid. I stress that democracy of the liberal variety, the deeper, fuller form of democracy, rests on three legs. One of them is majority rule. It's popular sovereignty where elections have consequences, and over time, the majority will can prevail, and everyone who, virtually all adult citizens are able to vote unless they've been temporarily convicted of a felony or something. Even then, I think we need to do more for felony enfranchisement and universal voting, but I'll come to that maybe at the end. But majority rule and free and fair elections, that's only one component of democracy. I think people around the world also aspire for freedom, a word that we're hearing now again on the streets of China. Freedom means all of the freedoms we have in our Bill of Rights: freedom of conscience, of movement, of assembly, of the press, other forms of expression, and protection for the rights of minorities, and the fundamental equality, at least politically, of all citizens under the law, which raises the third element of what we call Republican government, good government, a government of laws, of not people. And that includes checks and balances on the power of a temporary majority, and respect for the ultimate supremacy of constitutional rule. If anyone says, well, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, I think the correct reply is we have both, and the package is liberal democracy, or at least that's what we should be striving to achieve, deepen, preserve, and defend. What's been happening in the world in the last decade or so has been a gathering, what I've called democratic recession, not a depression, but a persistent and accelerating rollback of freedom and democracy around the world. Levels of freedom and democracy have been declining. The rule of law in many countries has been deteriorating. The instrument for these regressions has frequently been, in many countries, illiberal populism. I'll say more about what that is, but I think almost everyone on this Zoom understands what I'm talking about. And more generally, what we've been struggling with in the United States, but not only in the US and Poland and Hungary, to some extent in France, in Brazil, in India, and lots of countries in the world, increasing polarization and intolerance of rival parties, of ethnic and religious minorities. This, in turn, has been at least partially generated and certainly intensified by social media, which tends to elevate the greatest forms of outrage and fear and anxiety in the world. Then we've had a resurgence of authoritarian sentiments and power in the world, led by Russia and China. That may be changing now, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Democratic values and trust have been in the decline in US and Europe. I think maybe there's a little bit of a turning of the corner on that, both in Europe and perhaps in the United States in the last midterms. But, we still face serious challenges there. Extreme election deniers came pretty close to winning a number of swing state elections in the United States. And the person who has just assumed the prime ministership of Italy is an open and admirer of the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. And then things got worse during the COVID pandemic, though that's easing a bit in many parts of the world. So first, what's been happening? Well, liberal democracies have been becoming less liberal. Fortunately, this man, Jair Bolsonaro, lost the last recent October presidential election in Brazil. Of course, he's now challenging predictably the results, although I don't think he'll be able to pull it off, even to the degree of danger that Donald Trump mobilized in January of 2021. But there's been a trend of decay in a number of liberal democracies like the US, Brazil, and Poland. Secondly, many electoral democracies that have been illiberal, but at least robust electoral democracies, are seeing much steeper decline. I think India is still a democracy under this man, Narendra Modi, but the trend is in a worrisome direction. And then you've got a lot of other countries that have been moving like these countries in an authoritarian direction. And you now have, I think, pretty clearly authoritarian rule in Hungary, Turkey, and Bangladesh for many years now. And the Philippines kind of oscillating in a gray zone somewhere. The regimes that have been authoritarian, but we call competitive authoritarian, with some political space for opposition and dissent, have been becoming more brutally authoritarian. The brutal authoritarian regimes have become more brutally authoritarian in places like China, Russia, Venezuela, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And the result can be seen in a number of statistical trends I'm going to show you now. One is that if you count all the countries over 1 million population and ask what percent of them are electoral democracies, the blue line, trend line that you see on top here, we kind of reached a peak around 2006. Many of these trends for freedom and democracy peaked around 2006 and have been receding since then. We peaked at about 57% of all these more sizable states, again, over 1 million population, being democracies. We're now at less than half of those. And the percentage of these states that also meet a test of liberal democracy, that's declined to by about 4 percentage points. We've had about 16 consecutive years now. If I had updated this to 2021, you would see a ratio of 0.3 for 2021. About 16 consecutive years where more countries have been declining in freedom than have been gaining in the judgment of Freedom House. It used to be that in the post-Cold War period, for about 15 years, in most years, you can see here the ratio was above 1, sometimes 2 times as many countries, in 1 year, 3 times as many countries, gaining in freedom compared to the number that declined in either political rights or civil liberties or both. That kind of stopped in 2006, and the pattern flipped beginning in 2007. And in the subsequent years, we've had, the median point has been about 0.5, probably 0.6 as percent, 60% as many countries gaining in freedom as declining. And last year it was under 40% as many countries gaining as the number that declined in freedom. And, we can just march through these statistics. I'm happy to share these slides with people. You can see here that if you go by decade, the rate of democratic breakdown, that is the percentage of democracies that declined in any given decade, has been increasing. The ratio of democratic transitions in each 5-year period has been declining. And so, that makes for a democratic recession. Now, I'm going to ask how this has happened, and then I'll ask why, but in explaining how, we already begin to get purchase on why. And the how has typically involved the rise of this term I used a few minutes ago, illiberal populism. It is a form of political appeal or mobilization that has a long history through the ages. If you just think of it as demagogues appealing to the popular passions, this is something that our founding constitutional framers feared. And ironically, this is why they created an electoral college, or at least one important reason why. So, as Alexander Hamilton put it, they'd have a check against a political figure who would, in Hamilton's words, appeal to the little arts of popularity. And you'd have a kind of indirect method instead for filtering that out and choosing a president. Well, we've been stuck ever since with that indirect method of the electoral college. And in 2016, it elected an illiberal demagogue as president of the United States. Well, before that, in the early 2000s, it brought an illiberal and ultimately authoritarian populist to power in Venezuela. It brought illiberal populists, the Law and Justice Party, to power in Poland. And what these parties and politicians say, and the kind of tone and framing of their appeal, is remarkably similar across countries and cultural and historical contexts. They run against elites and try and create a separation between the established elites, who they sweepingly denounce as corrupt and arrogant, and the good, true, deserving people who've been exploited and treated badly and arrogantly by these elites. They run against institutions which they see as corrupt, antiquated, constraining of the will of the good, deserving people. And of course, they pose themselves, the populist leaders, not only as the embodiment of the popular will, but really the only legitimate expression of popular will. In this sense, they're anti-pluralist. They don't really accept the legitimacy of other points of view, other political alternatives. And they have a hegemonic agenda. They argue that they are the only leader or party who can fix the country's problems and express the popular will. In this sense, they use and respect in a certain minimal way elections, but only as a plebiscite to express the popular will, after which their view is that power in the executive should be unconstrained. The populist party majority should be able to do whatever it pleases, including beat up on minorities of various kinds, ethnic, religious, national, sexual, and stigmatize them as the enemy and the reason for all the country's woes. And this, of course, leads to extreme nationalism, chauvinism, anti-globalization, racism, ethnocentrism, and a lot of other very dangerous isms. These populists pursue, when they come to power, a mode of a creeping authoritarianism that I call the autocrat's 12-step program. It begins in the election campaign by demonizing and delegitimizing their political opponents in ways I've described. Once they gain power, they accelerate that, but they pursue 11 other steps as well. Early on, they move against the independence of the courts, and in Hungary, they succeeded. In Poland, they partially succeeded in purging the courts and remaking them in the image of the ruler and ruling party politically. Same has happened in Turkey and many other places. Invariably, they go after independent media. They threaten the people who own them. They put them out of business. They take them over. They gain control of public broadcasting as well. They constrain internet freedom. You wind up with a situation in Turkey and Hungary, to some degree in Poland, and even shockingly in India, which has been over the decades, remarkable example of media pluralism and independence, where the media is cowed and where the entrepreneurs who own print media and broadcast media understand that they'd better not be critical of the ruling party, and better still toe literally the party line, or their media could be put out of business, and literally they could be put out of business. The old phrase, "the tax man cometh," is very relevant in these situations. And I have talked to media entrepreneurs who have explained, and businessmen, how vulnerable they are to victimization by the state if they are seen as sponsoring or harboring criticism or supporting opposition parties or something like that. So the populists then go after civil society, independent organizations, universities, think tanks, and try to marginalize those. A tax investigation has just been launched against one of India's most important policy research institutes that we work with. I've already spoken about the intimidation of the business community, and the flip side of that is the enrichment through state contracts, uncompetitively bid, of a loyal crop of crony capitalists who slavishly serve and fund the ruling party. The incipient autocrat then goes after the state bureaucracy and the security apparatus, trying to politicize those and purge them of independent, not to mention opposition or unfriendly elements, so that they can politicize those as well. And then the last step is to, and often it's not the last step, it's an early step, is to rig the electoral rules, engage in a level of gerrymandering even more obscene than what we have seen in the worst instances in the United States. And so in a country like Hungary, for example, make it extremely difficult for the opposition to win, especially in a parliamentary system, because the ruling party is overrepresented in the more rural areas and regional constituencies where it dominates. The final step is to gain control over electoral administration directly, and use that to create an unlevel playing field and just reject results they don't like. And step 12 is to repeat steps 1 to 11 over and over. So why is this happening? Well, in many cases, the spread of democracy extended far and wide, including to many countries in Africa, some in less developed parts of Latin America and Asia, where the enabling conditions were not strong. The civil society was weaker, education levels perhaps a bit lower, and the rule of law in particular and other political institutions were weaker. So there was an underlying vulnerability. But we're also in an era that I think has been more challenging, where there's a backlash against globalization and the economic inequality and job losses that came with it, the status anxiety and economic dislocation that has affected a lot of deindustrialized areas in Europe and the United States. Social media has been a real plague here in terms of being a conveyor belt for disinformation and political polarization and outrage. Citizens were already inclined to be alienated because in many cases, they've not been doing well economically. Their incomes have been flat or declining, and then social media has made it worse. We've had an alteration in the balance of power. The West has been declining in power and self-confidence until recently. The Ukraine war is a testing ground now. China and Russia have been gaining, and at least for the first 2 years, the pandemic created a cover for authoritarian regimes to intensify their abuse of civil liberties and their control of society. And of course, it is exactly that intensification of authoritarian rule that the Chinese people are reacting against now. So this has brought us to a point in the last 2 to 3 years of not just a democratic recession, but I have feared something worse, a real shift in the global zeitgeist, the kind of mentality or balance of expectations and values in the world, a growing skepticism about the efficacy of democracy, a sense that maybe authoritarian regimes really are more dynamic, successful, and admirable in their performance. And that, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said in the mid-1970s in a phrase that turned out to be dramatically ill-timed, so that we can draw some hope in the failure of his prediction then, nearly 50 years ago. Liberal democracy is where the world was, not where it's going. Well, I think that's what a lot of people felt kind of going into this decade. Then it seemed to get worse with COVID. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, turned out to be not the kind of authoritarian juggernaut that some people were proclaiming, but turned out to be vulnerable to all of the colossal errors of grandiosity and misjudgment that dictators so frequently make. And so now the picture looks a little different, and I'd say more different still, given the disaster that the continuing COVID lockdown has been for Xi Jinping and for all of China. And we'll see where that is headed. Yet, it still needs to be emphasized, Chinese power has been surging in the world, and Russian power is penetrated not only the so-called near abroad of the former Soviet Union, where Russia has been intervening through digital operations and black operations, covert operations, to try and tilt power to its allies in Georgia and Moldova and a variety of post-communist and post-Soviet states, but where Russia and China have been spreading propaganda through conventional media, social media, bribery, China's Belt and Road Initiative, to try and flip social and political actors and media dialogues to their side. And these forms of sharp power, I think, even as Russia is failing on the battlefield, continue to pose a very serious challenge to democracies and to democratic morale in the world. We know about the Russian information war on American democracy in 2016. It was less successful in subsequent elections, but it's not going away. They're still trying to find ways to hack, subvert, and polarize and discourage our democracy. China has been building up the most massive global propaganda apparatus in history through something it calls the Voice of China, and is using a variety of united front tactics to try and penetrate social and political actors in democracies around the world, in Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Taiwan, most of all Taiwan, the United States, Canada, Europe, and so on. And we have to be alert to this and find ways of mobilizing what we called for in our 2019 report, constructive vigilance, to be aware of what's happening and push back against it. China's also not just using words and ideas, but money and kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic power. It's been acquiring critical technology firms, building and controlling infrastructure, ports, acquiring farmland, stealing our technology, forcing Western businesses to transfer technology to China as the price of entering the Chinese market. It's been massively increasing its military spending and modernizing its military for a potential attack on Taiwan. And of course, militarizing the South China Sea, which it claims is exclusively its own. It controls a number of supply chains, critical raw materials, and is trying to get to a situation where it will have independence in the supply of the semiconductors it needs, while we are still dependent on China. And you see now the crisis that's building in Apple because of its dependence on the Chinese supply chain for the iPhone. I hope this wakes up Apple and other Western companies to the danger of supply chain dependence on the People's Republic of China. So we don't know yet whether the end of the Cold War is now giving rise to a new Cold War. I think we're in a new moment now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And early on, it was fear and trembling in Central and Eastern Europe. Now it's a sense that maybe Putin really did overreach, and it could bring about the demise of his regime. I think when you look at history, you see that the way that aggrandizing and ultimately aggressive authoritarian regimes are contained is through strength and not just through negotiations. We have to impose high costs on aggression, and we have to sustain them over time. And it's the sustaining now that I think is really being tested and will be tested on the blood-stained soil of Ukraine and in the parliamentary halls of Europe and in the Congress of the United States, in terms of whether we have the will and the intellect to stay on the path of supporting a democratic Ukraine and ensuring that Russia cannot destroy an independent democracy. We have work to do to defend our own democracies and what we believe in, and I would like to say what we're fighting for figuratively, but now in a sense, literally in Ukraine. This means defending our own democratic norms, which I think we did a better job of doing in 2022 than maybe we have in the past, calling out defections and crucially defending the integrity of our elections in the United States. If we lose that, we lose the most fundamental and irreducible condition for democracy. I think we must pursue reforms. The one I particularly favor is ranked choice voting to depolarize our elections. I could talk about other reforms I favor. I'll give you a list in a minute, and pursue ways of reducing a polarization and emotional intense dislike of the other party rather than pouring fuel on the bonfire. I work closely with the National Endowment for Democracy, a congressionally funded but non-governmental organization, to assist democratic organizations, parties, and movements around the world through financial and technical support. This involves training coalitions to try and control corruption through civic monitoring and legal reform, to try to provide aid to states on the front lines of the democratic struggle, to in particular increase assistance to independent media, which I think is a critical player in the struggle to secure and improve democracy in many of these contested spaces, to use more diplomatic pressure to stand beside and behind independent media and civil society, to revive public diplomacy in the United States, which has been, I think, in institutional remission for 2 decades in the United States, to revive a principled battle at the level of ideas and information for democracy and human rights, to defend internet freedom and security and develop new technological tools to help people scale internet censorship and reach the World Wide Web, and to give people means for accessing the internet in private ways that protect their identity and insulate them from repression. There are ways of fighting authoritarian populism. We're seeing some successes, for example, in recent municipal elections in Turkey and the Greek parliamentary elections. I think a little bit in Brazil in the last presidential election in October. And the way to fight authoritarian populism is to cut against the grain of it, to transcend rather than reinforce political polarization, to create a broad political tent that welcomes in a variety of parties and ideologies that unite around liberal democracy, to make sure that we are responding to the tangible bread and butter issues of people's economic anxiety and aspiration, and to expose the corruption of the populist leader, because when you don't have checks and balances, it almost always surfaces. I think we've got to come up with a reform agenda for democracy, and many of the democracies that are being challenged by populism, and renew a kind of pride in our democratic constitutional heritage and in civic patriotism. And so I close with our own democracy, and these are my reform priorities. One is to strengthen the impartiality and capacity of electoral administration. I would like to get rid of partisan elected secretaries of state and do what most democracies do and make it a career neutral, professional civil service function. I've become convinced by the recent book of E.J. Dionne and Miles Rappaport, 100% Democracy is their title, that we should have universal voting, register everybody and require everybody to vote. I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting, the instant runoff to generate incentives for moderation and compromise. I'd like to do that. By the way, Alaska has done it through the reform it adopted in 2020 of Final Four voting. You end party primaries, have one blanket primary in the summer, nominates 4 candidates of whatever party, and then they compete in a ranked choice voting instant runoff contest in November. And of course, that elevated the moderate Republican, Lisa Murkowski, who probably would have lost a Republican primary, and enabled her to easily win re-election. I favor Supreme Court reform through the 18-year term limit. We're the only advanced democracy in the world that doesn't have term limits or age limits for our constitutional court judges. And I don't think this makes sense. And it's helped to make the Supreme Court the kind of ideological, high stakes, extreme battleground for our existential societal future that it has become. And I also am a strong believer in deliberative democracy. We have a program here at Stanford University that does deliberative polling. We're about to do a deliberative poll on democratic reform in the United States. If you'd like to know more about that, you can Google America in One Room and see what we've done. By the way, since I'm speaking to MIT alumni, I do want to note that one of the most important civic efforts to improve the capacity and health of electoral administration in the 2020 and 2022 elections and continuing forward is the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, which is led by law professor Nate Persily at Stanford and MIT political scientist Charles Stewart. So if you weren't aware that MIT and Stanford are already connected in the cause of democracy, there you go. Finally, I'm often asked, what can we do? And so I always like to end with this list of worthy organizations that I think are worth looking into to either support financially or volunteer for. So that's my presentation. Larry, I'm happy for you to make these slides available, and I am happy to answer everybody's questions.
Wow. Thank you so much. This is, things are moving very quickly. Yeah. I heard you give this talk 60 days ago, and
Yeah.
Your programs are the same, but the facts on the ground have changed a lot.
Yeah,
In
I agree.
Ukraine, in China, in Iran, and many other places around the world. In Brazil, with the stuff going on there, it's just fascinating. Just a quick note. I was an undergraduate at MIT in the 1960s, and we used ranked choice then.
Wow.
To elect our student body presidents and other student body officials. And in 1968, we had a campaign where the person who was polling third in the independent polls actually won, but with the trickle down, and it was the first time a woman was elected student body president at MIT.
Wow.
That's fascinating. So,
well, that's such a great story. I'm really going to try hard to remember that.
So I've been a favor of ranked choice voting for a long time.
Okay.
I just don't see any problems with that. What so questions and answers. What happened? Was there something that happened in 2005 that caused the ratio to flip? Countries moving into democracy versus countries leaving democracy. Was there an event that happened around that time frame?
Yes, I'm really glad that question has been asked. I think that it's very important. So let's think back to 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. What were some of the big things that were going on then? One of them was the Iraq War. I think this was very important in delegitimizing democracy promotion. Because if you remember, it came to be identified when we didn't find weapons of mass destruction as an effort in democracy promotion. And then it went very, very bad. It generated a lot of opposition and condemnation. It made it very difficult for me for a number of years to use the words democracy promotion, because every time people heard those words, they heard, U.S. tanks and planes imposing democracy. And of course, that's not what we mean. And it diminished the moral standing of the United States and caused divisions between the US and Europe. And then we had the global financial crisis not that long after. The Iraq drama was continuing to go on rather poorly through 2005 and 6. And, in 2008, the bottom fell out of the American financial system through greed and corruption in the United States. And what else was going on at these times? Growing concentration of wealth as a result of globalization and financial manipulation. And also Facebook was taking off and beginning to polarize our politics. And so these trends, I think, began to take hold, and not just in the US and Europe, but the social media revolution around the world. And I think they greatly complicated things.
Yeah, so that's many things all at once. Yeah. We could talk about nation building in Iraq, but let's not.
Okay.
You're probably familiar with Section 230?
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think? Should we adopt a change to that? What should
I am ambivalent about that. I think that there is a bill in the US Congress that would do that was introduced by our own congresswoman. So ironically, the congresswoman, or one of them from the Silicon Valley, Anna Eshoo, co-sponsored by Tom Malinowski in New Jersey, that would suspend Section 230 protection from the Federal Communications Act for internet companies above a certain large number of users, and require that, or provide that, they can be held liable for failure to moderate content that does damage to human rights. I don't know if that was the exact formula. I think you need to think it through very seriously, but I think we need much more far-reaching legal regulation of the major social media platforms than we have had to date. And so I am open to revisiting Section 230 of the Federal Communications Act.
How many, here's another question. Maybe you could comment on what's going on in China right now.
Yeah, well, I think that, we always want to be cautious about racing to analyze the latest development that's just kind of in embryonic form without knowing, where it's really headed and where it might be leading. So will this pass in a few weeks, or is it going to require a more fundamental reaction from Xi Jinping and the senior Chinese political leadership? We don't know that yet, but because it is not just happening in one or two places as a local protest, number one, but is widespread throughout the country, because it has been brewing for quite some time in reaction, frustration, and disgust with Xi Jinping's intransigence and insensitivity and arrogance and even brutality in enforcing the zero COVID lockdown policy. because there is real and widespread moral outrage to it, and because you have so many people in different cities taking to the streets, not simply saying, change your COVID policy, but saying, we want freedom. I think this is a very serious challenge to Chinese communist rule. And it could become the most serious challenge since 1989. I don't think that Xi Jinping is going to fall. I think in the short run, what he's going to do is engage in savage repression. But I think that his unwillingness to change, if he proves unwilling to change, could set in motion deeper dynamics of alienation and discrediting of the Chinese Communist Party and of all his ideology, narrowing of his base, and laying the groundwork for future political change.
Yeah. Yeah. There are several questions here that I think you've covered. You do such a fabulous job. I'll just read them off, and if you want to add anything to them, how many different or alternative paths are there that countries go through on the way to democracy? Maybe touch on that for a second.
Well, every country in a way is unique. But I think I teach a course on democratic development, which includes democratic transitions. So I would say I would prefer for the moment to identify three pathways for democratic transition. One is that there's an authoritarian regime, there's a democratic opposition. The democratic opposition or movement comes to have so much power that it can't be ignored. There's kind of a balance of power or a standoff between regime and opposition, and they negotiate a transition to democracy that protects the rights or protects the interests of the authoritarian rulers so they don't get arrested and prosecuted. And that's kind of the pathway of Chile, Spain, Poland, South Africa, quite a number of countries that made transitions to democracy. The second pathway is that something happens and the authoritarian regime crumbles. Usually it's a defeat in war or some other disaster, like Argentina after the Malvinas Falklands War, or some crisis of performance that leads people and emboldens people to rise up and overthrow the regime, and the regime loses its coherence and will and so on. And the third pathway is one that isn't open in China. It could be open in Venezuela. And it's basically a kind of color revolution pathway where there are elections. They're not free and fair. The authoritarian regime controls them, but nevertheless, the opposition mobilizes such massive electoral support that there's no way for the regime to convincingly rig the elections on that large a scale, and the opposition comes to power via elections. Now, then it might trigger some negotiations to get the authoritarian regime to accept the outcome, but that's the third pathway.
Got it. Yeah. I've heard it said that democracies never go to war against other democracies. There are no wars between two democracies. Is that true? Any thoughts on that?
The reason why you've heard it said so often is that it happens to be true. And I often challenge people to present to be an instance of two genuine democracies that went to war with one another. And, people fumble and stumble for the war of 1806 between Britain and the United States. I mean, that's ridiculous. Britain was an electoral but authoritarian monarchy. There's no one can present a single instance that falsifies the generalization. And the reason why is because there are good reasons why, and particularly when you have a reasonably liberal and constitutional democracy, people are not going to tolerate and choose to go to war with another democracy over differences that would be the kinds of ones that would be invented by an aggrandizing authoritarian regime. We might not be happy, in our trade with Japan or France, or there could be divisions of interests of various kinds. We're not going to go to war with them to resolve it.
Yeah, I agree. It's the only thing I could think of was the Falklands War, but upon investigation, Argentina wasn't that much of a democracy.
No, in fact, it was a military dictatorship.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
the democracy came later.
Yeah. So going down that path a little bit, you could argue that nation building. We tried nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan. It didn't work. And so it reminds me of something, Deng Xiaoping was asked one time what he thought of the French Revolution. And his response was, it's too early to tell. You probably heard this. And so that sort of says to me, we haven't been able, but we haven't been successful at democracy building, nation building. So what's the time frame we're looking at here? Are we looking at centuries? It's been more than 200 years since the American Revolution, almost 250.
There's an irony in what you're saying. It's true what you're saying, but there is an irony in it. And the irony in it is something that I need to preface with the coda. And the coda is that I was strongly opposed to the US invasion of Iraq. I actually spent 3 months working in Iraq in 2004 with the Coalition Provisional Authority, and then left early and wrote a very critical book on it because of our imperial attitudes, our arrogance, ignorance, isolation, and incompetence in that effort. So I was a strong critic of what America was doing in Iraq, but I will note Iraq has more elements of democracy now,
right.
17, 18 years later, than most Arab countries. There is a parliamentary system.
Right.
Elections had consequences. I wouldn't call it a democracy, but there's an element of electoral pluralism and accountability that very few other Arab countries have. And who knows, someday, if you can take, if Iran has a democratic revolution, and the destabilizing effects of the Ayatollah's Islamic Republic on Iraq are removed, you could see democracy evolve in Iraq. So you do need a longer time frame. But the nation building part of it, of your claim, is valid in this sense that we can't be present for decades in trying to steer and provide a steel frame for these countries to get over the hump of violence or insurrection or so on. And so I favored getting out of Iraq militarily because, I think that the time had come. And I don't support the way we got out of Afghanistan, but I don't think it was sustainable for us to remain there. because it had become like Vietnam in one sense. The government that we were supporting was so corrupt that it was incapable of ever reaching a level that was going to succeed in defending itself. And I don't think we can, I don't think it is sustainable to ask Americans to risk that level of treasure, of finite resources, and lives to defend that.
Oh, yeah. Lives and treasure. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Your thoughts on nuclear weapons? Are they? What do you think about that? Should we?
I think that they're terrible. I'd like to see them eliminated. I certainly would like to see a halt to nuclear proliferation. But I don't think it is possible to achieve nuclear disarmament in a world where some of the countries with nuclear arms or nuclear possibilities are authoritarian regimes, because you can't rely on them to disarm. So I think we should keep trying to move toward reduction in nuclear arms, toward enforcement of nuclear test bans, and to halt nuclear proliferation and de-emphasize nuclear weaponry and certainly nuclear proliferation as much as possible.
I don't know how to do that. I mean, there's enough uranium around.
Well,
you can't. I mean, you can't. Bottleneck. You can't corner uranium as a resource.
This is part of the problem. So it requires a lot of vigilance, a lot of monitoring.
Yeah.
When countries start enriching uranium, like Iran is, we're going to know about it generally. So there are provisions to halt nuclear proliferation. I do think that nuclear disarmament is not foreseeable or advisable, on the horizon.
Yeah, that's the deterrence argument. Yeah. I tend to agree with that. Here's a specific question from someone in the audience. The questioner is bringing a Senate staff delegation to Jerusalem and the West Bank in January. What strategies apply specifically to Israel now, post-election, post our election, and post their election? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't have the time to take the next half hour to articulate them all. I will just say that Israel has now elected what will be, once the coalition is formed, it appears, by far the most extreme right-wing government in its history. It will include people who have gleefully called for deporting all the Palestinians to Jordan, who have celebrated Israeli crazed extremists who have murdered Palestinians in cold blood. It's really chilling. And while that is not Netanyahu himself, Netanyahu appears willing, as the price of forming a government and keeping himself out of jail, to embrace those people and give them positions of power in his cabinet. And I think the congressional delegation, the Biden administration, American civil society, all need to patiently, but robustly make clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government that while we strongly support Israel, its security, its right to exist in secure borders, and so on, we're not going to sign up for a extreme violent suppression of the basic rights of significant parts of the population that are living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and that we will not sign up for annexation of the West Bank, which is something that some elements of his coalition favor. We will not sign up for deportation of the Palestinians. We won't condone acts of gratuitous violence that should be punished by either side. We need to keep repeating these basic principles.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I know you're pressed for time.
Yeah.
So let's call it now.
Okay.
I thank you so much, Larry, for your time and such a tremendous presentation, and for sharing your thoughts and perspective. So many good insights, as always. It's like getting the proverbial drink of water from a fire hose. I don't know if that's
been my pleasure.
Yeah, I don't know if they use that expression at Stanford. That's an MIT expression.
Yeah.
I learn something every time I hear one of your talks, and
Okay, thank you.
A terrific evening and experience. Thank you so much. To our audience, thanks for the astute questions. There were lots of them. Sorry, we didn't get to all of them. I'm not quite finished yet. I'd like to spend a moment on our next event, our next speaker on Wednesday.
I will say goodbye and thank you.
Yes, I know you have another thing.
Yeah.
Go celebrate.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So our next speaker on Wednesday, December 14th is former ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pfeiffer, who will talk about the war in Ukraine. Where are we now? Steve is an affiliate with Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, as well as a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. His interests are nuclear arms control, Ukraine, Russia, and European security. A retired Foreign Service officer, Steve's more than 25 years with the State Department included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine, as ambassador to Ukraine, and as special assistant to the president and the senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. He also served at U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as with the U.S. delegation to the negotiation on intermediate range nuclear forces in Geneva. Russia's invasion of Ukraine launched the largest war in Europe since the end of World War II, to the surprise of the Kremlin, which appeared to have expected an easy victory. The Ukrainians have fought with skill and tenacity with the help of arms and other military assistance provided by the West. A large gulf separates the two sides' negotiating positions, and the U.S. intelligence community believes the war could drag on for some time. Steve's talk will explore the Kremlin's motives for this war of choice, the course of the conflict, and the Kremlin's miscalculations. He will also address Western policy and what the future might hold. This will be a great session led by someone who has firsthand experience in the Ukraine-Russia arena and was personally involved in negotiating some of the agreements that established Ukraine as a country in the 1990s. I hope we'll see you 2 weeks from tomorrow, Wednesday, December 14 at 5 p.m. And again, if you have a chance to you bump into Larry, thank him for the excellent presentation tonight. One more thing, go Niners, go Warriors, go U.S. men's soccer. Have a great evening and a great holiday season. Good night, everyone.